Okay, should not be long.
No, no, there'll be just a couple of seconds here while I share the screen. So, sharing screen. Where is that? There it is. And what screen do I want to share? That one. So, you guys should be seeing the slideshow right now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, and you still see it. There's no interruption. Okay, so here's the context. I'm part of the Data Equity Working Group with the AI for Logistics program. It's Margaret McKay is leading that. And we met yesterday, in fact, and had a good chat about it. And there's a lot of interesting things about the data equity working group that come together for me and bring together other things that I've done in other projects. And we were just sort of setting up the parameters, what we're going to do. There's this tendency, you have a working group, you want to split off into sub working groups and that. And I think we've maybe resisted that, and I think that would be good. Uh, but where we're at now um, is, shall we say, thinking aloud about open data repositories. So, me being me, I have to try to do two things at once. So, I'm giving you guys a presentation, but I'm also offering these thoughts to that group as to how we can structure what we're thinking about that. So, these are actually words typed by Margaret. Actually, now that I think about it, every word in this presentation was originally typed by Margaret. But that's okay because I've done a lot of rearranging of them. So this is actually item 4 in our to-do list, and I think item 4 will probably blow up to be our to-do list. Um, but the idea is to look at the creation and public good use of data repositories, keeping in mind, of course, it's for logistics, so we always have trucks in the back of our mind because Irving. Uh, but, anyways, uh, what does that mean? Well, it means something like enabling data repositories for the public good, open data, appropriately gated data, that's her word. Um, and also the very ambitious idea of NRC as a data broker, etc. So, as you guys all know, I've been in repositories, in the repository business, as it were, for 20 years, starting way back with the EduSource repository. The second or third day I started with NRC, I was on a plane flying to Vancouver for the first meeting of a National Learning Object Repository Working Group. So I have some history here. So, why? Uh, why would we do this at all? Why is this interesting? Well, first of all, there's this aspect of supporting and advancing NRC's digital transformation. And my thinking on this, now here are some words that I've typed. NRC needs to understand and improve its own data policies. I don't think we have a good handle on that. Luke, you could probably add to that. And as well, I'm sure we could get useful information from Kits and others. But, we need to identify what our own needs are, whether we actually even believe in open data. I'm not sure we do. And what our problems and issues are in order to give us the insight we need to talk to others. But we also need to learn what's out there. And that was the sense that I got at this meeting, that we have this vague sense there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in open data and open data repositories. I personally know of initiatives, for example, at Statistics Canada, Library and Archives Canada. I'm sure Treasury Branch has they're probably up to their elbows in it, and more. Not to mention what's happening outside of government and then other governments. So I think we need to learn these things just generally, just to get a handle on how we as an organization even want to look at data, much less data for logistics. So uh, that gives us, an ability to identify the necessary elements to coordinate, if we were even to want to coordinate, and I'm not sure we do, a holistic Canadian approach to open data. And then that opens the door to potential commercial opportunities, potential ways to support small to medium sized enterprise, etc. So that gives the context of why we should be working on this. So, next, what would we be trying to work on? Well, I think there's probably three major areas. Again, these are all Margaret's words, extracted and reorganized, because I'm a shameless stealer of other people's ideas. So, first thing, access, openness, and transparency. I think, the way I've phrased this in the past is we should be thinking of these as the default rather than the exception. We should begin with a presumption of access, openness, and transparency, and then try to define the exceptions to that rather than presuming that everything is confidential and then trying to define the exceptions that we will allow to be open. I think NRC is still in that second model, where the default for everything is confidential, and there's lots of reasons to say that. Although it's interesting, last year or the year before, I was actually part of meetings on openness and open government as it affects NRC, and the belief expressed at those meetings was, oh no, the default for NRC is open. And so I think there's an internal disconnect about just what our stance on this is. And I think we need to come to grips with that. Then the idea of breaking down barriers to data access and data silos. And if I had a little plus sign here, I'd be talking about things like common data standards, data formats, metadata, etc. There's a whole wealth of things to talk about there. And then jurisdictional issues, federal, provincial, interdepartmental, public, private, publicly owned, privately owned data, privacy requirements, and that's, not just the personal privacy legislation, but also the degrees of confidentiality that we have here at NRC. So those are the things that we need to address directly. Who is important? Because
Stephen, can I ask a question, or do you want me to wait to the end?
No, you by all means ask a question.
So who is it that thought that the NRC's default was open data? Was it the NRC itself, or was it like Treasury Board?
No, it was internal to NRC. I actually reported this at one of our HCI meetings at the time it was happening. I don't recall the exact name of the committee, but it was a committee to get feedback on NRC's open government plans.
Okay. Yeah, I remember you mentioning it.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the
and
details.
it's funny because in that meeting I'm sitting there explaining that our managers and directors are busy telling us that we need permission to share anything. And
Sure.
And then on the other side, and Jean-Francois can attest to this, I have to advocate the position, look, Canada has an open government policy. All of this stuff should be open by default, and the default shouldn't be that we have to report anything before we're allowed to release it. So there is this internal contradiction. I think there's no question.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, good question. And anyone else, if you have a question or comment, by all means, jump in. You won't be slowing it down. We're like more than halfway through already. Thought it'd be a short presentation. Okay, the who. So there's other stuff in the who. I meant to put another line in there, but didn't have time. Another of Margaret's lines. Because there's the whole issue of identity, digital identity, identity management, etc. And we need to think about how we would like to approach that. Do we like the idea of self-sovereign identity? Do we like the idea of federated identity? What about things like two-factor authentication? How do we set that up? What's the appropriate way to set that up? And this also overlaps into encryption policies, encryption keys, and all the rest. Should my key be a standard? Should we be using a third party kind of thing that's maybe standard? Stuff like that. And then just, when it comes to ownership of identity, who actually owns that identity? So that's one thing. The second thing is the whole question of ownership of the data. So, we have in Europe the GDPR, where people have things like, the right to be forgotten and significant rights over their own data, as contrasted with the wide open US position. And we sort of fall in the middle. There was a recent Canadian discussion paper released. I covered it in my newsletter, which kind of falls halfway through, or halfway between the European and the US position, of course. And basically what it is, if I had to characterize it in a few sentences, it's the European position, but with huge exceptions carved out for business. So it's the European position, but completely gutted. And I'm not sure if that'll fly. I think long term, as Canadians, we may prefer something more like the European position over the American position, but who knows where we'll end up. And then we need the actual systems and methods to exert whatever rights that we have. How do we actually manage our own data? How do we actually manage our own analytics? Does each of us get our own data repository? Do we use a federated system, etc.? Now, a related issue, especially as respecting data equity, because remember, this is all about data equity, is in addition to the individual rights to data, we also need to look at collective and cultural data rights. And of course, in Canada, the most significant instance of that is Indigenous data rights, cultural knowledge, traditional knowledge, and all of that. It's not individually owned. And that immediately raises the question of who speaks for them. And of course, it being Canada, we don't have a clear answer to that question, as we've seen in the pipeline debates. It doesn't belong in the public domain. You can't just appropriate Indigenous culture and make it a logo. Well, right now you can, but you shouldn't, right? Shouldn't be able to. So those issues are important, but also is the recognition it's not just Indigenous culture that we're working with here. Canada is a mosaic of cultures. Most of them are imported. Indigenous culture is not imported, and that's what makes it distinctive. But, there was the discussion about yoga and who should have the right to teach yoga, who speaks for the practice of yoga. Is it still yoga if it's taught without the cultural and spiritual background of it? These are all issues that will come into play in the sphere of data rights and data equity. So that's the...
May I stop you one moment?
Absolutely.
Stephen?
Yeah.
How do you define cultural data?
That's a good question. Now, I'm the last person to do definitions, so how I define cultural data is kind of...
Well, would you describe it? Do you have some examples?
Well, I mean, the example... stories, right? Like, I think that's a good example. There are traditional stories that have been handed down through the generations in First Nations communities. That one about the two wolves in your heart. One is good, one is evil. Who wins? The one that you feed. I've butchered that story. That might be one, I don't know, but that's a good example to use, right? if that is in fact a story that's been passed down through the years, then that would be an example of indigenous culture or traditional knowledge. And it's not owned by any specific individual, although Disney has probably stamped a copyright on it. Um, but that's the thing, right? It shouldn't be something that Disney can copyright, or anyone else for that matter. It shouldn't be something that I can make a career telling that story, because it doesn't belong to my culture. It belongs to another culture. But who makes those determinations, right? That's the issue. Well, that's one of the issues. The first issue is it doesn't belong to me. I don't automatically have rights to use it. I think that's the first issue. Does that answer the question?
Partly.
Partly. What part's not answered?
Oh, I mean, whenever we talk about culture, I mean, I have some difficulty to find the boundaries of a culture
Yeah.
or stuff like that. So for myself,
Well,
uh,
I think
it's
that's
sort of, I think I usually avoid because I have no clear definition of that.
yeah. I don't think cultures have clear boundaries. I mean, if we thought they do, I mean, all we need to do is point to the Métis and say, well, where's the boundary there, right? Where's the boundary between Métis and Indigenous cultures, or Métis and traditional French Canadian cultures? And what even constitutes a culture? I mean, my background is Irish. Um, do I get to claim cultural appropriation because of St. Patrick's Day and green beer? Uh, you know, uh, Part of me says yeah, um, but on the other hand, another part of me says, well, I mean, that's so thoroughly part of the overall culture. Um, so yeah, I agree. I mean, defining one culture versus another culture, defining those boundaries and lines, those are hard issues, and I don't think those are issues that we should actually even solve. I prefer the grayness of it, the gray areas of it.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. Thank you very much for the
Mm-hmm.
answer.
So, by the way, do you like my little pop ups? I learned to do that 10 minutes before this presentation.
Interesting.
Okay, so how? Uh, I think the how is probably the most interesting thing. And there's three aspects of how that came up. The first is data literacy. And as you all know, I'm involved in a data literacy project with Department of Defense, Canadian Armed Forces, um, and oops, that's not the one. This one. So, nope, that's not, sorry about that. So there are four aspects to that project. First of all, the different models of data literacy. Second, mapping what we mean by data literacy to the requirements. Third, measuring it. And fourth, how do we actually improve it? It's the mapping data literacy to the requirements is probably the trickiest part, right? Because in any sort of learning program that's sponsored by any sort of agency, there's always this desire to go back to the objectives of the agency and say, we're offering this training, and I don't even like that for data literacy, but that's a separate issue. We're offering this training in order to support our particular requirements. And in the case of the Canadian Forces, it won't be, profits or efficiency. Rather, it would be something like an operational advantage in the field. And you can define that as appropriate. So, okay, so there's those aspects. And then the question of measuring it, and then actually how to improve data literacy. And like I say, I don't think simply throwing training courses is the appropriate way to go at it. I'm not even sure that enhancing data literacy competencies is the way to go at it. I think a lot of data literacy has to do with organizational structure and practices. In other words, it's more of a collective thing than an individual thing. And as an example of that, I go back to our first slide about how NRC handles data, and also to the work that we did with the School of Public Service and how they were handling data. And the people in that organization could have been 100% data literacy, but because of the way they were doing things, they weren't going to work well with data to meet their objectives. And the same is true with NRC. So I think that we have to look at both sides of this. Improving individual capacity, yes, but also aligning the organization so that it becomes a data literate organization. But enhancing data literacy was out of scope for our current discussions. So, okay. Whoops, did I just kill my slideshow? I did. What a moron. I hit the wrong spot on the slide. Click to exit. Oh, there we go. And let's start it again. All right. So the second thing about data literacy is, what is data literacy? And a lot of this goes to address some of the other questions that we've been looking at so far. And I did quite a bit of background reading. I'm still in the process of doing that background reading. There's a lot of stuff. It's a very new field. It doesn't really come into existence until 2008. Doesn't really take off until 2010. Kind of parallel to MOOCs in that way. That's kind of interesting. But there's been a flurry of activity in a few distinct centers. And really it breaks down into 4 overall data literacy models. First of all, just the practices of data stewardship. What is good data management? How do you manage things like data lakes, data pools, data marts, things like that? How do you manage source of truth? How do you define source of truth? Those sorts of questions. They're of interest to things like library and archives. And custodians or producers of data. The second one, which comes up most of all in data literacy because they're aimed at management and executives, is analytics and decision making. How do you do data supported decision making? How do you do analytics? And that's where a lot of interest has been paid. Third, and I think this is probably a more broad area of data literacy, is data literacy thought of as a branch of information literacy. And so what that means is, how do you read, say, a dashboard and actually come to an understanding of what the situation is? Or also, how do you distinguish between reliable and unreliable data? Fourth area is science and research, which is probably more where NRC would be focused, rather less where, say, the Department of Defense is focused. So how do you support scientific data? How do you share scientific data? Those sorts of questions. How do you do data-informed research? And then finally, and this is sort of like a subcategory. It's not even a full-fledged category, though I'm sure it will be. I'm just loosely calling it socially defined data, or data as with respect to society and culture. It's very loosely defined at this point in time, but there is a category there. There is a model there. So that's it. That's the presentation. As you already know, if I click on this slide again, it'll go blank, and that tells you that it's over. But that's, I think, the overview of what we're going to need to think about if we're thinking about, as the title says, thinking about open data repositories. And I think if we can begin, as the Data Equity Working Group, if we can begin a dialogue on those questions, identifying sources, identifying people who have an interest in them, I think that would be a good start. And then that would put the Data Equity Working Group in a good position to be able to respond to questions regarding data equity, regarding data ownership, and regarding open data. And that's my presentation. Comments and questions, more than welcome.
I do you I have a question too. Do you guys discuss about the data standardization? So let's say like when we are, so I even don't know like how much of a variety of data you guys are talking about, because like you are talking about like cultural data is like the story, and I even don't know how you actually define, and yeah, I don't know, but it sounds like super broad that I guess it's super hard. But let's say when we are collecting data from, I don't know, like our study, so we always define our data format by ourselves, right? Then whenever we share the data with the other researcher or scientists, like they have their own data format, and but sometimes it's useless because of because sometimes they don't collect the data what we need, or we have to talk to the researcher itself what the definition of this, and why this data looks like this, and so on. But if the data is standardized, and maybe it helps to like at least to share the data, like it has to be readable, right? Then
Yeah.
so is there any like work around those standardization, or like even within like small area of data set you are working on?
So I think this is gonna the question is about standardization of data and the usefulness or quality of data that results, and I think this breaks down into two major categories. The one, and I mentioned it briefly, is the breaking down barriers to access and data silos, and here we're talking about how to make data from one organization or one source useful to another organization, or another data user. Data standardization is a common method for this, or alternatively, the creation of what are called crosswalks from one data schema to another data schema. This was a big issue in learning data. It's still a big issue in learning data, and what typically happens is you have two or three competing standards. We have that in education. We have the IMS standards, and then we have the ADL standards. IMS is the corporate side, ADL is the military side, and never the twain shall meet. And that's going to continue to be a problem. I don't think we can necessarily impose a single standard. I certainly don't think standards can be imposed from outside the actual community where the data is being produced and used. In other words, it will be up to biologists to determine how they want to define biological data. It will be up to healthcare providers to define healthcare data. And the best we can do, and the role we should play, is to be as supportive and assistive in that, and help them reach that middle point where it's necessary. But it's the old XKCD cartoon, right? There were 12 data standards, and an initiative was set afoot to unify all of these data standards, and the result was there are 13 data standards, right? And that's the usual result. The other side of it, I mentioned but didn't talk about on this last slide, is data quality, and education suffers from poor data quality, and I'll be the first to say that. These quantified surveys of 5 people, things like that, the lack of rigor, but even more, the lack of a good understanding of what constitutes evidence in a discipline. there are debates in education around the need for double-blind studies of what they call treatments or interventions. But I'm skeptical about that because I'm skeptical about the outcomes that they're measuring, which is increased test scores. And I don't see that as a good defining indicator of education. But what is, right? And so, there's a range of data quality factors. I think, and there's a range of issues related to data collection and recording anyways, representativeness, for example, understandings of built-in bias, etc. All of those are factors. I think data literacy and data ethics, and they sort of, you notice how they sort of bookend that particular item on this slide. I think those two things will go a long way toward producing better data. If we talk about how we use data, and how to understand data, and also what people think is right and wrong with respect to data, I think that will go a long way to improving the actual data quality.
Yeah, I think that related to the data quality, it's also the I'm curious how we can manage, for example, if somebody updates the data, or sometimes there are like error in the data, right? Then if somebody that part, so that is no longer original data, but if you could keep track of these change, and somebody might get the benefit of using those updated data, not the original data, but still we want to know somebody actually changed the original data and so on. There are those, I don't know, how we can manage those update and of the data.
Yeah, data cleaning, data revision,
Yeah.
those are good issues. And then, who owns the results of that
Yeah.
is also a very good issue. We know that there are, again, in educational metadata, one of the big problems was that people would make mistakes filling in the forms.
Right.
Huge problem, right? So, against that, a lot of people, including myself, propose things like automated data generation. But of course, then you get built-in or systemic errors, which, it's like the same sort of error a human can do, except at 1,000 times the magnitude. That's, and it's funny, there's in the history of philosophy, there's quite a bit of discussion about this in philosophy of science. The Millikan oil drop experiment is a classic case. The original version of that experiment was a water drop experiment. And they switched to an oil drop instead of a water drop, not because they thought they would get different results, but because the data was a lot cleaner with the oil drop than the water drop. They didn't get all the unexpected, noise, if you will, randomness in data using oil. So is that appropriate, right? Do you just change your experiment until you get nice, clean data? There's from a philosophical point of view, there are issues with that, and and so some have been critical about the very finely tuned scientific method of data collection as being artificial and generating abstractions where really we shouldn't be generating abstractions. And I'm sympathetic to that view.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for this super interesting presentation. This is definitely food for thought. It seems to me like an Herculean task to do, but someone has to start somewhere, and this is pioneering presentation on this. So thank you very much, Stephen. If you can put it on the wiki, would be appreciated.
I can't because I don't have green access, but I'll
Oh,
send
you
you.
don't have the green. Okay, so
No,
send it to me. I'll do it.
I'll send you the slides and the audio recording. It's the audio only from my end. Sorry, but it might be useful.
Okay, excellent. Okay, we have 15 minutes left, so about 2 minutes each to summarize our progress report. So